All right. Great. Let me just close this. So hello, everyone, and welcome back to Lambda School's Intro to User Experience Design course. My name again is Nick Basile, and tonight we'll be taking a look at one of my favorite UX activities, user research. And as always, if you have a question along the way, please put it in the Slack channel for this course, which is the UX_August27. And please start each of your questions with the question mark emoji so I can quickly scan the chat and respond. And then at the end of tonight's course, I'll run through the questions and answer as many as I can. But before we begin, we had a few questions that sounded like from yesterday about natural mapping. So I wanted to cover that again really quick. So the term natural mapping comes from proper arrangements for the relationship between controls and their movements to the outcome from such an action in the world. So last night we kind of had the example of the oven with all the burners kind of spread out and arranging the dials in such a way that we naturally map them to the burner that they're related to. So in this example here, we kind of have the car seat controls, and we can see a really nice example here where they've naturally mapped the buttons to where we know the action should be occurring on the chair. So we kind of have the head button there, and we've got the back button, and then we've got the bottom button. And they've naturally mapped that to our mental model or understanding of what a chair should look like. So that's a really good example of natural mapping. The other buttons, though, while they have a lot of affordance that they are buttons and they're clickable and that we can interact with them, they're not really as naturally mapped, right? Because they're just kind of buttons with labels on them. So the kind of L-shaped chair is a really good example of natural mapping, while the other buttons, they have a lot of affordance, but they're not necessarily naturally mapped to where they're supposed to be. So I hope that kind of clarifies some of that confusion we might have had coming off of yesterday's lesson. But moving right along to today's topic of user research, and we'll start with the product design cycle we explored in the last lesson. So we can recall that the discovery phase is a time where designers seek to understand the user in context and in relation to the product. And in doing so, we'll need to employ various research techniques to build up our understanding of our users. Now, research comes in two forms. In discovery, which is kind of what we're focusing on tonight, the most useful form of research tends to be qualitative research, which consists of gathering non-numeric data, or specifically data about the various qualities of an entity or environment. For example, interviews that don't collect counted answers tend to be qualitative in nature. Surveys with open-ended questions and observational research are other good examples. So one form of research that is especially useful to user experience design is called contextual inquiry. And contextual inquiry consists of observing users in the circumstances in which they would actually use the product you're attempting to design. So contextual inquiry is a form of ethnographic research. Its objective is to describe, and in many instances help you as a designer to view a culture or people with empathy. And the better you know and understand a person and their circumstances and experiences, the better you are able to formulate and articulate ideas to help improve the experience. So while we just talked about qualitative research, the other prominent form of data gathering is quantitative, which consists of the collection and analysis of numeric data. And that's probably what we're all a little more familiar with coming into this course. So surveys with responses that are counted in some way are an example of quantitative research. An example of quantitative research in user experience research is the System Usability Scale, or SUS. And it's a survey that gathers quantitative usability data. So it converts usability constructs into a 5-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And here we can see an example of that in the 10 questions asked during a SUS assessment. And so kind of running through them all, I think that I would like to use the system frequently. I found the system unnecessarily complex. I thought the system was easy to use. I think I would need the support of a technical person to be able to use the system. I found the various functions in the system were well integrated. I thought there was too much inconsistency in the system. I would imagine that most people will learn to use the system very quickly. I found the system very cumbersome to use. I felt very confident using the system, and I needed to learn a lot of things before I could get going with the system. And so those are kind of standardized, and you would always ask those during an SUS. And then the question responses are scored according to the SUS scoring system that then results in a score from 1 to 100, with 100 being the best possible result. And then this score then gives you a sense of how usable the product is compared to other products. So it's a pretty useful tool in your own research. Analytics are another form of quantitative data that can be informative in the discovery phase. Many companies install code on their sites and apps that count the activity of people using their site or app. So Google Analytics being kind of the preeminent example of that. So for example, it might count how many visitors you had on any given day. And analytics programs allow you to record specific interaction with the site as events. So those events can definitely be counted as well. And you can see how many times the event occurred, when it occurred, what time of day that event occurred most frequently, and all sorts of extra data. So there are enormous amounts of data that get collected each second on the web, and a UX designer can often access that data to try to make assumptions and draw conclusions about who is using the site or app and for what purposes, and thus hypothesize about where improvements could be made. Also, the results of A/B and multivariate testing, where different designs are compared statistically, can also be informative in the discovery phase, but are more often used to validate design solutions as opposed to actually generate the broad research you might look for in a discovery phase. So the early stages of user research consist of acts of discovery. User research is exploratory. And in user experience design, there are generally two roles you play here. The first is when you're creating a new experience where none existed before, and thus filling a gap. And the second is where you iterate and improve upon an existing experience and smooth out the surface of an established product. And in both cases, you use user research to understand the circumstances of a person's existing paradigm or mental model. You're seeking to understand the user. And without that understanding, you cannot design adequate and appropriate solutions to the gaps and rough experiences people endure each day. The discovery phase is an inductive process that digs deep for that understanding. And once a designer has a good concept of what a user is currently experiencing in the design scenario, they're better able to form design hypotheses that will move the process of design forward. So empathy is getting in someone's shoes and walking around for a while. It's seeing what they see and how they see it. Now, no one can be perfectly empathetic, but empathy can be learned and cultivated. People drawn to UX tend to have a more developed sense of empathy, but that skill can definitely be honed and improved. Empathy comes most easily through systematic and direct observation and listening. It can be refined by pushing back against the biases and assumptions that naturally occur to us. The closer we get to the actual life circumstances of our users as they use or would use our products, the better we will be able to be to make informed decisions about our designs. Data from research informs ideation and the rest of the product design process. The more accurate and realistic the data, the better our designs. Now, this slide might be the most important one of the entire course. The best UX designers are incredibly empathetic. They can practically remove themselves from their designs and substitute their own user's life and experience instead. But they can't do that without a foundation of research and experience to draw from. So let's talk about a few methods of research you could potentially use in your design process. The methods span from direct observation to indirect observation, and from direct inquiry to indirect inquiry. These, like the design process itself, are not necessarily discrete types of inquiry that always happen independently. They overlap and run into each other, but it's helpful to have names for these activities to be able to discuss them. And for the rest of this lesson, we'll act like we're designers hoping to create a new shopping mobile app, and we'll explore these research activities in this context. So like we covered earlier, contextual inquiry is a direct observation method of user research. It's an ethnographic technique where you shadow a user throughout the day, or at minimum for a period of time where they would be most likely to use the product or service you're planning to design. So for our shopping app, our lead UX designer, Ruth, contacts 5 mothers she knows and asks them to participate in her research. She explains to each of them that she will spend most of the day with them and just follow them around. So it turns out that 3 of these mothers agree to participate. So first, Ruth goes to Jennifer's house and sits down at her table and watches as Jennifer goes about making her meals. Ruth jots down notes in her notebook as she watches. She knows that Jennifer keeps her cereal high in a pantry closet, and she knows that breakfast starts promptly at 7:30 a.m. Ruth tries to capture each task that Jennifer tackles. She notes when Jennifer struggles, when she pauses for a long time. Then Ruth goes with Jennifer as she drops her youngest child off at daycare. After that, Ruth and Jennifer go to the store, and Ruth notes the path Jennifer takes through the store. She watches as Jennifer compares prices, how many she compared, whether she picked up items or just read the labels without touching. Every step throughout the store and then back home again, Ruth watches Jennifer's actions. She takes notes about her observations, jots down ideas she might consider later, and importantly, she notes the time and the location with each note. At the end of the day, they part ways, and Ruth begins the process again for each of the others who agreed to participate, watching and taking notes. Sometimes she might ask a question, trying to get into the minds of the women she is watching. What are you thinking right now, or why did you do that? Ruth's aim is not to spur the woman to answer a specific way, but to get them talking about some of the tacit and implicit things that are going on in their minds as they take action. So after the contextual inquiry, Ruth does a competitive analysis. She looks at other shopping apps that exist. What did they do well, and what might they be missing? To answer those questions, Ruth performs a usability study on her competitors' apps. So she contacts some new people and invites them to the office. She has them use the competitors' apps and talk about what they're doing. And her objective is to see how people use the app, what works for them and what doesn't. She gives them specific scenarios or goals for the user to achieve with the app. She watches to see what obstacles the customer faces as they attempt to achieve the goal. She notes where they struggle, where they succeed, what excites them or delights them. From the notes she gleaned from her research, Ruth is ready to move on to the definition phase of the product design cycle. So the last few research methods have been extremely time intensive. So what could Ruth do if she had limited time and couldn't follow around multiple people for a day, as is commonly practiced in the industry when we're on very tight design cycles? So she decides to use some indirect observation to gather the same type of information she gained in the previous scenario. She recruits four participants to do a diary study for her. One of the mothers she recruited previously, who wasn't willing to be followed around, is willing to do a diary study. And during the diary study, each participant carries around a notebook or recorder for the next day. And every 15 minutes, they write or record what they're doing at that moment, along with their thoughts about their activities. Then Ruth gets the notebooks or recordings and reads or listens to gain insights into their activities. In addition to the diary study, Ruth looks up analytics data from the web for any shopping apps she can find. She finds out that many people are using shopping apps. She looks for marketing data about the demographics of shoppers, when do they shop, how old are they, and what are they buying. Then to supplement these findings, she also spends a day doing in-depth interviews with potential users of her shopping app. And she recruited users through her social network, so gathering friends of friends and friends of friends of friends. And 5 people agree to come in. So one long day, she conducts 5 one-hour interviews with a half-hour in between. To prepare, Ruth creates a guide that contains multiple questions she can ask, along with some probe questions. Ruth also asks a fellow UX designer to listen to the interview live with her, to take notes so she can concentrate on the conversation. Gathering this data will allow her to begin the definition phase of the design process. Ruth could also use other methods even further removed from interaction with the user. One form of indirect inquiry is a survey. Surveys are able to gather information from users about their experiences asynchronously. Surveys are potentially dangerous because writing useful questions that will result in quality data is a skill that requires practice. Questions that are too broad result in imprecise data, and ambiguous questions result in meaningless data. Also, multiple choice questions can potentially miss the nuance of the human experience. But surveys do have great potential for getting a clear picture of trends across many individuals, They also potentially allow for statistical extrapolation. So they're useful, and they certainly have a time and place in our toolkit. In a classic example of being too removed from users or the danger we might face with a tool like surveys, Clayton Christensen's well-known milkshake case study offers us a cautionary tale about the importance of getting closer to the user and probing for a greater understanding of their needs. He formulated a product methodology based on this research they did call Jobs to be Done. So the milkshake case study basically goes like this. A fast food restaurant began marketing research based on their milkshake product and around the demographics of their milkshake customers. They sought to find out from members of that demographic what makes the best milkshake. So customers told them, and the company responded to feedback, trying to improve the milkshake. And after implementing these improvements, they didn't see a change in sales. So instead of asking customers what exactly they wanted to see in a new milkshake, one of Christensen's colleagues did a deeper dive. Instead, he observed customers buying milkshakes all day and realized that 40% of them bought them in the morning and left the restaurant before consuming them. So he came back the next day and asked people in essence, what job are you trying to get this milkshake to do? And it turned out that these morning consumers needed something to help them get through their morning commute. They only had one hand to drive with and weren't really hungry, but they knew they would be hungry later. And the milkshake helped keep their free hand unoccupied. The shake lasted a long time, so it helped keep them engaged on their long commute, and it also helped them avoid hunger pains until lunchtime. So the true competitors in this category could be considered to be bagels or bananas or toast or coffee. And then the restaurant could respond to this idea by creating a new product and marketing it around the morning commute, sort of a morning milkshake that might be thicker to tide you over for the rest of the day. So trying to understand what job a user needs to have done allows you to craft better products and experiences because it helps us connect the dots between what a user is doing and what they actually want to achieve. So now that we understand some different ways to conduct our user research, let's explore some best practices for conducting interviews. So first up, have a recorder and ideally a backup recorder. Most people have a smartphone, and there are numerous apps you could use to record voice. Ideally, you want a device that will allow you to export your audio files as an MP3 so you can re-listen and take better notes on a computer. There are also services that can be used to record interviews over the phone, and there are links in the course notes to some of those. When you do record someone, it is super, super important that you get their permission before doing so. It's the law in some states, and it's the right thing to do everywhere else. Next up, have a notepad. If you're interviewing over the phone or a computer connection, you can take notes on a laptop, but generally speaking, you want to avoid using your computer to take notes in a face-to-face situation. Computers can form a psychological barrier between the researcher and the subject, reducing your ability to build sufficient rapport to have your subjects open up fully to share their honest experience. And make sure you have a pen or pencil and a backup as well. Finally, don't rely too much on notes, and don't take copious notes. Spending time taking too many notes can disrupt the flow of a conversation and make subjects begin to close down their thoughts. So instead, to take notes, jot down a time code from your recorder along with a keyword to help jog your memory when you go back and review the audio recording. So the next thing you need is an interview guide or script. And the purpose of the interview guide is to make sure you remember to cover all the questions that you need to cover in order to understand the scenario. Generally aim for one primary question for every 5 minutes of interview with 1 or 2 probe questions that can help you dig deeper. As you get going in an interview, it's often easy to just go with the flow of the conversation, but you must remember you have specific objectives for the interview. And having those objectives and questions in front of you helps keep you on track and not forget anything important. So we've actually got one prepared for this, so let me open up now and then we can go over this in detail. So if we bring this up here. Alrighty, and don't worry, we're gonna get you guys access to this as well a little bit later. So yeah, so at the top here, and this is generally a really great practice to have, so that way you have all your thoughts organized and together before you start conducting the interview when your time and the participants' time is very, very valuable. So I typically will start with today's date at the top, and then the objective. So in our case, we're trying to better understand the experiences people have with shopping in a brick and mortar store. And understanding their experience will give us insights and empathy to find ways to improve their shopping experience through digital or other tools. So that's more internal for us. But then the introduction is actually a script that we would read to the participant. So it would go something like this. So, hi participant, my name is Nick Basile, and I'm going to be asking you a few questions during this session. Let me explain a little more about why we've asked you to participate in this interview today. We're interested in understanding more about people's experiences with in-person brick and mortar shopping. The more details I can understand about your offline shopping experiences, the better we'll be able to create products that can help enhance that experience. I want to make it clear right away that you're not being tested. There are no right or wrong answers. We want to hear exactly what you think, so please don't worry that you're going to hurt our feelings. We want to improve our designs, so we need to know honestly what you think. You don't have to answer all my questions, and you're free to stop the interview at any time. We will also not publish your answers outside of our team. We will just be using this information internally to help guide our design efforts. Is it okay for me to record this conversation? Recording helps me so I don't have to take as many notes. So the introduction is really important, and I really recommend writing it out and reading it verbatim. And you can typically just tell your user subject that, hey, I've got this kind of bit of text here and I don't want to miss anything. So I'm just going to read it for you and just make sure we're all on the same page at the end of it. So that way you don't miss anything important. For example, like asking them to record, that's really important to get their consent before you do that, and you wouldn't want to miss it. So that's definitely an important part of the process. And then once you've finished the introduction, you can go into the interview questions. And we always like to try and frame the conversation in the context of their most recent experience, as opposed to asking someone to say, like, can you generally tell me about your time in the store? When you ask them that, then the subject will typically say, give you a really aggregate perspective of what they've always done, as opposed to a more specific use case that might be more valuable for you. So we always try to prime them a little bit and ask them to focus on a recent visit or activity so we can get really specific examples. And so questions for our interview would be, when was that visit? What store did you go to? What was your reason for going there? What did you purchase? And actually, when you see it organized like this, what we're typically trying to do is we kind of have one primary question, and then we have some probe questions afterwards that can help you to quickly follow up on whatever answer you have in the first part of that question. So then we have, what did you purchase, if anything, that you're not planning to purchase before entering the store? What were you doing before going to the store? Where did you go afterwards? Who was with you? What did they do while you were in the store? What kind of a list did you use, if any? How did you carry your shopping items while you were in the store? Tell me about your checkout experience. And then kind of having a bonus section, if time permits, you can then ask them to recount their recent visit to another store and then go through all the same questions above again. And so with these questions, what we're really trying to draw out of the user is a more holistic understanding of how they visit the store and what insights can we glean from their experiences and how they participate in that interaction. So we can hop back to our keynote now. Alrighty. And so now that we've kind of got a better understanding of this, I'll actually go through a user interview right now with Boomer, who has graciously volunteered to be our user for tonight. And basically, we'll go over the scenario we just covered in the guide, and I'll cover some best practices as we're doing the interview. And the most really important thing about this whole process is to remember, when you're in an interview, is be present, listen actively. If you're in person, sit on the edge of your seat, maintain eye contact, lean forward. You want them to know that you're engaged with them and what they're saying. And if you're leaning back, you're bored, you're making doodles in the margin, that lack of engagement will close them off, and you won't be able to get the deeper insights you're looking for. And if you're doodling in the margin, you kind of have to question what insights that you're going to be able to get if you're not paying that close of attention. So, Boomer, can you hear me?
I can.
Awesome, awesome. So for now, I'm going to skip the introduction because you've heard that already. But Boomer, can you kind of think back for me to your most recent visit to a store? And can you kind of tell me when that was, where it was, and what did you go shopping for?
Yeah, so it was today. It was to the
Hmm.
Fry's, which is a local Arizona store,
Hmm.
and I went there for vegetables.
Nice. So, what vegetables in particular did you get?
I had to get bell peppers and onions for my fajitas
Ooh, that sounds pretty good. You make fajitas often or
very often, every week.
every week? Nice. Right on. So I'm gonna try and jump and forth here between interviewing Boomer and giving you guys some best practices here. So if we were in person, I'd be watching for visual cues, and now over Zoom, I'm listening for vocal cues, so that way I can kind of interpret his body language and any signals that are suggesting like discomfort or disinterest or anything positive as well, and kind of making notes of that as well. And then another technique is to dig deeper and ask why. And there's a technique called the 5 whys, where you literally, every time they answer your question, ask why again. And you go as many times as 5 to really get a fuller understanding and perspective of the questions you're asking. So in that example, we kind of did a little bit where Boomer was talking about getting vegetables, and I asked him what vegetables he was getting, and then we got on the conversation of talking about fajitas. And another tip here is what we're really trying to do is draw out the stories from our user and get a much fuller perspective here. So let's see here. Let me ask another question here. Boomer, did you purchase anything that you hadn't planned on purchasing before you went to the store?
I did.
You did. And what was that?
It was soda.
Soda. Do you often purchase soda, or is that kind of a one-time?
Yeah, so I only own a motorcycle. So
Hmm.
anytime I'm at the store and I have extra bag space, I will
Hmm.
frequently stop and get soda because I have the space and I never have enough.
Gotcha. Cool. And what were you doing before going to the store?
Working.
Nice. Let's see here. So again, another tip here is to avoid generalized questions like, how do you usually do X? Instead of, we really want to get specific here and describe the last time you did X. And that's something really hard. And you might have noticed me even tripping up on this in this example, because naturally in conversation, we're trying to get at the what of the conversation. But here we're much more interested in the why and the how and the additional details that really color our perspective here. So it's a difficult thing to do, and as is this entire process. So practice and really understanding and having these best practices in mind will certainly help you. So let's see here, Boomer. I've got a few more questions. So where did you go after the store?
I just came back home.
Came back home, and then did you do anything with your groceries afterwards?
I just put them away.
Put them away.
I,
Nice.
I take that back. I cut up the veggies.
Oh, cool. Awesome. And was anyone with you when you were shopping?
No.
No? Okay. And did you use a list when you were shopping?
No.
No? Okay. Great. And so another tip to get into here is people don't always do as they say. I'm not saying Boomer didn't use a list and did use a list, but that's what we're trying to do is watch for inconsistencies and ask more about them. And we're not trying to catch anybody in a lie here, but we're just trying to help them feel comfortable and express what really happened as succinctly as possible throughout the interview. And another tip is to really never fear silence. It often takes people some time to sift through their thoughts. So make sure to give them a chance when you're having a conversation. And then another good tip is don't lead the witness. So you should never be suggesting answers to your questions. So people often will give you the answer you want to hear if they know what you want to hear. And this is why it's really important that you have a list of questions before you go into the interview. So at least your kind of core questions, you're making sure that you're not asking yes or no questions, but you're asking those much more descriptive questions so you can get that fuller perspective. And I know that having a conversation with someone like we're doing here, it's very easy to fall back into the trap. And it's something that I do and I have to work on actually. Because in a conversation, you're going to want to say things like, oh, that's awesome or cool. And I'm sure I've even done it on this recording. But you really want to try and control that for yourself and make sure you're not responding with positive or negative words. You're just trying to respond in a human way and continue the conversation. And then finally, our last tip here is to save the toughest questions for the end. And that's kind of a tip that we picked up from the world of journalism. But there's a lot of information we can get from a subject before we ask them the really hard questions. And this isn't going to happen in every user interview. But for example, I've worked on projects in the medical space, and asking some sensitive questions to people can really change their mood and emotions and really kind of change the entire complexion of the conversation you're having with them. So if you save those tough questions for the end, you can have a much more open and honest conversation before that, and you can actually build some trust and rapport with the person so they're more likely to answer your tough questions. So yeah, so those are kind of our tips and kind of a general overview for how to conduct an interview. And thank you so much, Boomer, for being our subject tonight. I appreciate it.
And then also, since we're talking right now, there's a question in the Slack.
Oh, sure.
When conducting an interview, do we ask open-ended questions more than closed-ended questions? And when should we use closed-ended questions?
Sure. So yes, when we're conducting user interviews during the discovery phase, so at the very beginning of the process, and we're trying to get as much data and as much information as possible, we definitely want to be asking these open-ended questions. If there's something really specific that might be really useful to your app or design in particular, you might want to, if you can start with an open-ended question and that conversation goes to a natural place where you can ask that really closed-ended question, I would say that's a decent scenario. But typically in these interviews, we do want to be asking more open-ended questions so we can understand the entire perspective of the user in question. I think that, hopefully that covers it. Yeah, so let's keep moving on right now. So for today's assignment, we'd like to have you conduct the user interview just like I did. And so hopefully last night, we kind of asked you to recruit someone for this. And otherwise, the project managers will be able to set you up with other students who don't have a subject for tonight. So let me open up the assignment and add the link to Slack here, and then we'll go over the guidelines with you all right now. All right. So that should be on the screen. Perfect. A little slow tonight. And can view, great. Alrighty, so y'all should have the link now. Hopefully you can jump on. So this is tonight's assignment. So like I said, we'd love for you to conduct a 25-minute interview, and hopefully you've arranged for that person to be joining you tonight. So for your instructions, so basically duplicate the interview guide template so you can use it, and that link is to this file that we just went through with Boomer. So basically this exact same template, so we're going to give you guys that. Make sure you review the objective statement, review the primary and probe questions, and add any additional questions you'd like. This is your interview to conduct, so we'd love to see what questions you guys can come up with. And if you can record the interview, that would be awesome. I know we didn't ask you guys to kind of have that in place, but if you can record it, that would be great. And then conduct the interview using the principles that we just discussed, and take notes as appropriate in the interview guide. Then once you're done with your interview, write down the 10 most important insights you gleaned from the interview. And the insights should include several about shopping and maybe a few about what you learned about yourself or what you could do to improve in the future based on the best practices we talked about. And if available, review the recording as well and make notes about that you didn't glean from your in-person interaction, but you were able to glean from the recording. And are there any verbatim quotes that are useful from your user? Those are always super fun to discuss in your group discussion. So afterwards, once you've done your interview and your group discussion, you can go ahead and make a master list of insights about shopping. And this list should consist of any insights gained by anyone in your group. And you should consider any insight useful for the list. And so eventually, a little bit later on this course, we're going to use these insights on the list to generate ideas for products that might improve the shopping experience. For now, though, just capturing this raw insight is what we need. Also in your groups, please feel free to share any of the insights about the interview process that you gleaned from the experience. What would you change to improve the interview? What did you learn about yourself and your own interview skills? How could you improve, and what went well? And I think you'll be well on your way to being a UX designer after this. And I know this is not everyone's most comfortable and most favorite topic and activity, but it really is a fundamental skill, and learning how to glean insights from users and subjects is really what's going to propel you forward as a user experience designer. And as you practice, as you get more comfortable and familiar with it, it will get easier and easier every time. And so you'll be well on your way to being a UX pro. And then finally, if we come back to the chart here, and okay, it's a question. So let me hop into Slack and see if I can answer some questions. And I'll try to make this quick so you guys have plenty of time to prepare for that interview. So let me see here. So Ben was saying he saw the term CX, which I'm assuming is customer experience design today. And how does customer experience design fall into UX design? And that's a really good question. Customer experience is a much broader design paradigm and thought. It's also much newer. It's probably been much more recently that people started to think about this. Whereas user experience typically is dealing with digital products and how people are interacting with those artifacts and products. Customer experience kind of is a business focus on the entire experience that a customer undergoes throughout their life cycle with the company. So actually, in my mind, customer experience, or CX, is broader than user experience, which is much more focused on customers' digital experiences within a company. So CX design might include the marketing materials that you send to potential customers. Really good example of this is like airports and how they manage their kiosk at the beginning. So that's a little bit of a combination of UX design and customer experience. But then the printouts that you get and putting in your bags, your interaction with the gate agents, the interaction with all the folks on the airplane, the pilots, the flight attendants, everybody out there helping you. That all kind of falls into the much broader category of CX design. So I hope that kind of answers that question. And then I think we already answered Peifang's question about the interviews. Any other questions, folks? Any books or articles you recommend to help improve our interviewing skills? Yes, there's a really good author called Steve Krug, and he is a UX researcher and designer. And so his books are in particular very helpful and focused pretty exclusively on interviewing users. So he is a phenomenal author. I'm trying to remember the exact name. I think it's Rocket Surgery Made Easy is his book on specifically like usability studies, but those principles can be applied to these this discovery process as well. What about the next question from Aaron here is, what about interviewing users, customers that you know well? You change how you interview people that you know compared to those you don't. So that's a really good question. When interviewing folks that I know well, I typically don't have to try as hard to build that rapport and that trust. That's already kind of implicitly there. But I don't really try to change how I interview them. I give them the same introduction. I give them the same questions. The conversation might be a little different. But I really try to stick to the same questions because at the end of the day, if I had different question sets for all my users, I'd be trying to compare sort of apples to oranges throughout the process. But if I give everybody the same questions, even if the conversations are different, I know I had a common starting point, and so it's easier for me to draw comparisons amongst that set of people. But ideally, what you're trying to do is find users who are representative of your target market or people you would expect to be using the app. And so sometimes those are people I know well, sometimes they're not. So it really depends on who you can recruit. And of course, it's always easier to recruit friends and family. Excuse me. So I understand that inherent tension. Let's see. So Ben's asking, how long should an average interview be? You mentioned an hour in the talk, but we're doing a 25-minute one. How long are they usually in the industry? That's a really good question. I've had them be very long. I've had them be as short as 15 minutes. So it really depends on how many questions you probably come up with and are ready to ask someone. And we kind of, our guideline is to have one sort of primary question per every 5 minutes. So in our case, we've got, looks like almost 10 of them. So that'd be like a 50-minute combo we'd be expected to have. And of course, the probe questions count for less, so we're not counting those. So that's kind of a rough guideline, but it really kind of depends. I haven't really found a one answer for that. It's really, and also it depends on the person you're interviewing. Some people are not big talkers, and you really have to draw the conversation out of them. And then other folks love to talk, and you're pushing an hour, and you've got another interview scheduled, and you're trying to wrap things up. So it really depends on your question set, how talkative the interviewee is, and probably a couple other factors as well. So there's no one right or wrong answer, though. It's really whatever you need, the amount of time you need to draw out all the relevant information from the subject. And is there a minimum number of interviews you want to do? That's also a really good question. It probably depends on the riskiness of the product undertaking that you're thinking about. So if you're designing, for example, a driverless car, for example, and there's a high stakes associated with it, where if you get the product or the design wrong, there are some tremendous consequences. You're probably going to want to do a larger number of interviews than our shopping list app, where we might be able to get away with maybe 10 or 20 to really understand a experience that everybody has. That said, I know when we're doing this discovery phase, it's always hard to recruit users. So it can be a little tricky to get sort of numbers in the door. But for like an app or a product that doesn't have really high stakes associated with it, I would say anywhere between 7 to 15, I would feel pretty comfortable that you've gotten a broad swath of the population. Yeah, thank you. Alrighty. So I want to make sure you all have time to prep and get ready for your interviews. Any other last kind of questions before you all dive in? Also, I don't know if I said this earlier, if you guys have questions that you don't feel comfortable asking in the chat, or you just want to ask me directly, I'm pretty frequently available in Slack as well, so feel free to DM me, or feel free to ask it in the chat at another time, and that works as well. Not to cut anyone's last minute questions off here. If you want to go for it, and we'll wrap it up here. But yeah, I'm always available if y'all have a question, and even if it's something not directly related to this course, but just kind of UX generally and design generally, and even code. I'm a developer as well. I'm happy to talk and kind of answer some questions. Okay, so the question is, do companies usually provide the resources to select candidates? I'm just wondering where we would find the interviewees to accurately represent the audience of the product. In my experience, I have had companies help me recruit candidates, and I have had other companies say, you're the user experience designer, that's your job. So it's a delicate game. If you can have your company help you out, typically the marketing department is conducting some sort of marketing research, and they are generally the closest to the customer. Or if you have a sales rep or account manager, they're very close to customers and can typically make a warm introduction for you. So those have been tremendous resources when I've had to go out and find candidates in established companies. On my own, when I'm working in more of a startup environment, or I'm just testing an idea and trying to get feedback, I found a lot of success through just Twitter, through social media in general. Reddit actually is surprisingly a really good resource. If you can get into a subreddit that you would expect your users to be active in, that would also be another good place where I've had some success. And so if you can establish yourself and get some credibility, you can generally get some folks to use your test as well. And then I'm going to answer one more from Aaron here, and then we'll kind of close it. So what about users who use your product versus those who don't? That's a really good question. It's much easier to get people who use your product versus those who use competitors' ones. That's really true. Typically, you might be able to go on other people's support forums or search forums and find users that way who have complained about your competitors' products, and that's generally a good way to do it. Ideally, though, when you're designing and you're in the discovery phase, you're really just looking for folks to kind of fit your target demographic and people who you would expect to use your product. And so if they can kind of just fit that criteria, those are the folks you want to be recruiting for the interviews. So I hope that answers that. All right, folks. Well, I think that'll wrap us up for tonight. And y'all will have the chance to do these interviews on your own. Like I said, if any extra questions, feel free to ping me on Slack. And I hope you all have a good night.